I'm going to tell you about one of the most terrifying things that I've ever seen in my life. I've spent a lot of time in the wild, and I feel like I'm pretty comfortable with knowing what's around me and knowing the possibility of what I will run into. But this time, I can't say for sure. So I want to set this up. I wasn't exactly out hiking in the great outdoors or lost in the woods or anything fun like that. At the time, I was actually in Central Oregon, outside of Redmond, Oregon. Outside of Redmond is pretty much like a desert, and there are rattlesnakes and other things like that lurking. So you have to be really careful. Well, I'm not going to go into the details because it's kind of embarrassing, but we'll just say that due to losing a bet, I was kind of out there in the middle of nowhere. I had been for hours on end without getting a ride or anybody picking me up. So I'm out there trying to find my way back to the road when I see something moving off in the distance. Now, this isn't like the typical Arizona or New Mexico desert where it's so scorching hot you have illusions. But what I saw from far away wasn't your typical desert illusion like palm trees and an oasis. No, this is what appeared to be a large, upright dog walking off in the distance and going perpendicular to the direction I was walking. I watched as it stood up behind some brush and began walking. This thing was a tall, black figure, and the first thing I noticed was its tall, cropped ears. It kind of resembled the head of a German shepherd, but it was fully black, and its ears were very long and pointed. Its body kind of reminded me of somebody in a dog suit, and whatever this thing was, it had large, long claws. I could see it clearly from where I was. I mean, it was about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and it was in the spring for whatever that's worth. Also, I was roughly 75 yards away if I had to take a good guess. This thing casually walked off till I couldn't see it anymore. I don't know what it was doing, why it was there, or where it came from, nor do I know exactly what it was. But it definitely freaked me out, which I'm sure is no surprise. I kind of gave slight mention of it to my friends hours later when I found the main road and they picked me up, but I didn't really go into it all. They just laughed at me and said it was a good thing they got there when they did. With that, I just shut up knowing I'd be asking for it if I said anything further. At the time of the encounter, my brain explained away all the oddities about the creature. As I stood there, it was telling me that it was clearly somebody in a suit, or that my friends were pranking me. But the farther and farther it walked, and the longer I stared at it, the more and more terrified I became, realizing that nothing exactly added up. Don't forget that I was looking at some upright, unknown animal that nobody thought should be there. I hardly knew anything about Bigfoot. I mean, I had heard the stories, of course, but I'm pretty sure that it didn't look like an upright dog. This was something else entirely, right? So fast forward a little bit later, and I tried to do some research on the subject. Well, it turns out I'm pretty confident that I actually did see some sort of dogman creature. This thing, for whatever reason, was in desert in Oregon. Why? I don't know. And are they commonly seen in this area of Oregon? I don't know that either, but I will never forget what I saw. My biggest hope right now is to someday meet up with someone who has had a similar encounter. I'd love to just sit and talk with that person. I'm sure there is a lot we could say to each other. One of my passions is finding forgotten pack trails that were once used for transport before modern roads. Obviously, modern roads have made them obsolete for transporting goods, but they are still a cool way to go for foot travel. Also, a lot of them give you good access to hunting grounds that people just don't remember about anymore. I found some incredibly efficient routes for packing out game with a lot less exertion than navigating through a lot of rough terrain. My uncle got me interested in this back when I was in high school. He was a real old-timer who always had an instinct for getting back to the old ways. The first trail we did together was after we found a hand-drawn map in a book. It started at this very specific point in southwest Oregon that used to be the site of one of the original post offices in the United States. It went along the Rogue River and up Mule Creek past some old mining sites. I remember how excited I was that day when I realized how accurate that old map was. I felt like a pioneer or something, like I was packing freight on a trail that existed before civilization was really established. I remember walking up a ridge and making it up to Hanging Rock, where there used to be a lookout tower where you could see out over the Rogue Canyon. But that was a long time ago now, and my uncle's not with us anymore. But I was feeling nostalgic, so I wanted to recreate that trip. I researched the area and found out the trail went along the whole length of Panther Ridge. I started off on the west side of the trail. I got to Hanging Rock, and then I walked a couple miles down a jeep road to Old Red Mine. I hiked the whole trail that day and was done by late afternoon. It must have been 13 or 14 miles. I was tired and hot, and I was standing by the creek looking upstream. The mine was across the creek on my right and up on a flat shelf of rock. There was also a miner's shack about 10 feet above the creek. I had brought some camping supplies with me, but nothing luxurious. I just found a spot to roll out my sleeping bag, and that was it. I made some dinner and then just walked around exploring the creek area for a while. I was really tired though, so the sun hadn't even gone all the way down behind the ridge before I climbed into my bag. I hadn't been laying there for very long when I thought I heard the sound of rocks rolling on the other side of the creek. I was half asleep and didn't pay it much attention. But then I heard more rocks rolling down from the direction of the shack. It sounded like something or someone was sliding down the slope toward the creek bed. Along with the sound of the rolling rocks, I could then hear the splashing of water in the creek. And then it sounded like something started to climb up the bank on my side of the creek. It sounded like it was maybe 30 feet downstream from where I was laying in my bag. At this point, I was really wishing I had brought the tent so I wasn't so exposed. I turned my body to see what was happening, and I managed to catch a glimpse of the backside of whatever it was as it moved away from the path. I only saw the back of it, but what I saw was huge. I was expecting nothing more than a raccoon or something, but this thing was shocking. It looked like it was taller than me. It was covered in dark hair, and it was walking upright, but it was hunched over. And this horrible stench of garbage started hitting me from that direction. It seemed like it had a thick mane of hair around its neck and shoulder area. The fact that it was walking on 2 legs is what really shocked me. But the knees seemed to be bent the wrong way, like a dog or something. Even now, I still can't understand where something like that would come from. It must have weighed over 300 pounds, maybe even double that. I started speculating on possibilities like maybe it had escaped from a zoo, or maybe it was some kind of animal deformed by an injury. When you see something like that, all your brain wants to do is to make sense of it. I was really scared. I was stuck out there with a long way to walk. I probably had about 20 miles to get back to where I parked. The batteries in my headlamp would probably only last for around 4 hours, and it was starting to get really dark. And I had no idea what direction this thing was going to decide to go or if it had even seen me. At the exact moment it disappeared into some bushes, I knew I had to make a move. Within a few seconds, I stuck my feet in my boots, jammed my stuff into my pack, and tried to cross over the stream without making any noise. I made it to the miner's shack and closed the door and pushed everything I could find against the door to block it. There were 2 rooms in the shack, and there was an old table and a couple of tree stumps that looked like they had been used for seats. That's what I shoved against the door. In the back room, there was a wood frame that was about 3 by 6 feet. I had a feeling it used to be a bed frame. I spent the night sitting on that frame, positioned with my back against the rear wall. The wall extended over the creek, which meant there was a barrier from any potential intruders outside. Throughout the night, I kept thinking I heard the sound of footsteps outside, and a couple of times I swore I heard this low, growling sound. But I was incredibly freaked out, and maybe I was imagining it. But I didn't hear anything trying to get in the cabin. At daylight, I made myself choke down a protein bar for energy, and I steeled my nerves to open the door. As soon as it was light enough to see the trail at my feet, I got the hell out of there. That whole experience was really a mixed bag. I'd started out so happy to do the trail that had made me feel close to my uncle, but I've avoided that whole entire forest ever since. It's crazy how things can turn on a dime. Hey Donovan, I'm still trying to get over what happened to me, but I wanted to share it with you and let all your followers know about this sinister creature I encountered in the woods. I'm a park ranger stationed in Bear Mountain State Park in upstate New York. It's not really upstate, it's only about an hour's drive away from New York City. In the summer months, droves of people from the boroughs flock to the park to experience even a small sliver of nature. Most of my days are spent responding to overly ambitious hikers who either get lost or hurt themselves while up on the mountain. Now that it's much cooler, traffic to the park has slowed down to almost zilch, and I get a few months of breathing room and tranquility in the outdoors. I became a park ranger for that very reason, to spend time outside in the places I love and to get paid doing it. I'm from the city myself and found solace in the fact that every summer we would leave behind the concrete and traffic and spend a week at my uncle's cabin up in the mountains. A few weeks ago, I took a mini vacation. I had some things to get done around my house, but I decided to take 2 days for a solo overnight hike through a seldom traveled stretch of the park. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. There's an old ranger layover station that I chose to be the finish line for my hike. It would cut out the need to bring a tent and was easier to keep warm with a solid roof and 4 walls. I set out the morning of, and the buzzing of everyday life quickly washed away from my consciousness. I tend to lose myself in the woods. Not literally lost, but I let my mind wander wherever it wants as I take in all the sounds and smells around me. I had walked the better part of the day and was maybe 2 hours away from my destination when it happened. Not really focusing on anything, my subconscious must have picked up on a series of strange sounds coming from the thick forest east of the trail I was on. Snapping back to the present, I stopped and tried to hear the noise again. It sounded like singing, but somehow faded, like it was there and not there at the same time. I don't know how to explain it better than that. The tone of the voice led me to believe it was coming from a female. It was coming from the right and a little up ahead of me. The way the trail curved would take me right near where I thought the sound was originating from. I have to admit that I was a little unnerved. I hardly ever encountered someone on this trail, and definitely not a lone woman. No sexism intended. I figured that someone just singing in the forest was harmless enough and decided to continue along and come what may. But as I rounded the bend, the singing stopped. She was staring directly at me as I came around the curve and I came to a full stop. She was dressed in tattered and filthy rags, and her hair was matted down to her head. She was covered in dirt and grime, which made it hard to guess her age, but I figured maybe her early 20s. Seeing this poor girl in such a condition, I immediately snapped into my here to help mode. I gently started approaching her and asking her softly what had happened and letting her know that I could help her. She just stood silently, not answering my questions, but as I got closer and closer, her lips slowly grew into a sneering smile. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I stopped walking towards her and stood still, waiting for her to do or say something. When she saw that I had stopped approaching, her smile vanished. That's when I finally noticed the smell. Rotting meat like a deer carcass left on side of the road for too long. I don't know how I hadn't noticed before, but the stench was overpowering. I started gagging, trying to gulp down fresh air, but with each breath I took, it just felt like the aroma was seeping into my lungs, and I started to feel chest pains. Through blurry, tear-strained eyes, I saw the woman undergo some kind of transformation, her feminine physique transmuting into something else entirely. It grew in stature, towering over me. Pallid and bony limbs sticking out from each side. Pockets of rotting, darkened flesh ran the length of this new creature. Its head, now elongated, hosted a pair of warped onyx sockets stared at me. Watching this happen only drove me into a further panic, causing me to hyperventilate and suck down even more of the sickening aroma. Things started approaching, and I felt on the verge of losing consciousness. My vision began fading. I heard a gunshot followed by the single most inhuman wailing noise I have ever heard. Within seconds, my breathing was returning to normal. The horrible smell was fading away, and as my vision returned, I felt somebody grabbing me firmly and lifting me to my feet. My initial reaction was to fight, but it was a man's voice, and I quickly restrained myself. Able to see again, I took a look at the man, a pair of them actually. I couldn't see their faces. They were both wearing gas masks. They were wearing military camouflage, but had no rank or insignia of any kind showing. They both held rifles in their hands and stood patiently as I got myself together. When I was finally able to speak, I thanked them and asked them what they were doing there. They didn't answer the question, instead asking me if I had been touched. I didn't understand, and they asked again. "Did it touch you?" one of the men asked again. I told them it had not, and asked exactly what the hell it was. Again, no response. The men told me to wait a moment, and they walked off together to speak privately. I looked around and didn't see the thing anywhere. After a few minutes, they both returned to me. I was told to forget about everything I had just seen and to leave the trail and return home immediately. Don't stop, march through the night, and get out of here as quickly as possible. If I heard any voices, especially a female's voice, I was to run and not stop running for any reason. And that's it. I tried asking questions, but both men just turned to leave. As they went, I swore that I could see emblems of the Catholic cross etched into the butt of their rifles. They walked away up the trail without another word. I had no intention of spending any more time on that trail than necessary and hoofed it out of there in record time. It was long past sunset when I eventually got to my car, and I was terrified the whole time, but nothing else happened. This was 2 weeks ago. I have no idea what she, or it, was. Twice I caught a faint whiff of that same rotting smell, but it dissipated quickly. I don't know if I'll be able to ever go out in the forest again, and I reached out to a police recruiter in Manhattan to see if a transfer was possible. Stay safe out there. When I tell you I work for the ESA, I don't expect you to believe me. I appreciate the skepticism. I'm a skeptic myself. I've been a part of the European Space Agency for 12 years. In those 12 years, I've learned that the great celestial void isn't hiding as many secrets as we think. Just rubble and dust, planets and stars. Space is simple. Once the mystery's gone, it's hard to buy into any of the crazy theories about corrupt NASA programs and little green visitors from Mars. If you can believe me for just a minute, though, I have a story that you might want to hear. It involves Mars, actually. Maybe I should have paid more attention to those conspiracy theorists after all. In 2022, we found something inside of Mars's moon, Phobos. The Mars Express orbiter was launched years before I joined the ESA. It was designed to explore Mars and its immediate surrounding bodies with the aid of camera systems, spectrometers, and subsurface sounding equipment. Recently, that sounding equipment was upgraded. That allowed us to peer more deeply into Phobos than ever before. We didn't expect to find what we did. There are structures beneath the surface of that moon. If you search for any of the ESA official reports, those structures are vaguely defined. And the agency avoids going into detail by claiming that we're still early in the process of analysis. That's a lie. We knew what we were looking at right away. Maybe we should have expected it. If you don't know much about the two moons of Mars, I'll quickly explain. Phobos and Deimos are named after the Greek gods of fear and terror, and they don't resemble the Earth's moon at all. They're incredibly small by comparison. Phobos is less than 17 miles in diameter, and their surfaces aren't smooth or round either. The two moons resemble lumpy asteroids more than naturally occurring satellite planets. Many of us theorize that these were remnants of a larger asteroid that made impact with Mars a very long time ago. We were wrong. I held the subsurface photographs in my hand. I was among a team of 6 individuals responsible for identifying the structures beneath the surface of Phobos. I could instantly tell that the structures were rooms. There were clearly defined walls and chambers. There were hallways and staircases. We immediately realized what we were looking at. Phobos isn't an asteroid at all. It's a ship. Our conclusion wasn't published. In fact, the report we provide was buried almost immediately. That included the subsurface photographs. We were warned not to, but we still made plans to leak this story to the press. I was afraid. I would have kept my mouth shut too if the ESA wasn't trying to cut us out of the very discovery that we made. They'll be collecting new samples from Phobos' surface. I'm sure they'll be digging a little deeper than usual, too. It will be like we were never there. I will no longer be with the ESA by 2024. Why not end things a year early, I thought. They didn't have a problem keeping us on the payroll for another 12 months, but the threat of the guillotine hanging over my career was enough to force me into action. But I did discover something else. The subsurface photographs that my team examined weren't the only ones taken by the orbiter in 2022. There were several that we weren't allowed to see. These copies weren't confiscated because they'd never arrived in our hands. I'm no hacker either, but after the system identified me as the user accessing that area of the library, our power suddenly failed. When it returned, the documents I was looking at had been deleted. Before the lights went dark, though, I got a good look at what they were hiding. On a level deeper into the surface than anything our original photographs had captured was something besides walls and hallways. Long dead, I imagine, as their skeletal bodies were strewn across the floor with no apparent rhyme nor reason. We had proof of it in our hands, and we chose to keep it secret. We could have destroyed and validated any number of those conspiracy theories that I hated so much. Instead, we made plans to gather more. The future adventure with Japan won't stop at the surface of Phobos. If you have believed any of my story thus far, then I beg you to also believe this. That future endeavor with Japan in 2024 will enter that ship, and they will bring back the corpse of an extraterrestrial. Mark my words. Hi, Lilith. My strange encounter happened about a year ago. I know this story is not one of your typical encounters, but it happened. I have seriously been shaken ever since. I work at a national park in Kentucky. It is called Mammoth Cave. Mammoth Cave is a massive cave system, currently known as the most extensive cave system in the world. It has over 420 miles of explored tunnels, and that is still expanding. The portion outside of the cave is a large park as well. It is a great place to take a family on vacation. Families can hike, kayak, and explore the cave. However, as I say this, I also preface my words with saying to be cautious of your time inside the cave. I have worked at many parks throughout my career. I have a niche in war history, specifically weaponry. Mammoth Cave was an exciting placement for me. The bats that live in the cave produce guano, a key component in potassium nitrate, better known as saltpeter. And saltpeter was used during early wars. Enslaved people were forced to mine it. Several artifacts from that period have even been recovered from the cave. I am not one to typically believe in wild tales. However, after my encounter, I discovered your channel hoping to make sense of what I saw. Honestly, though, it has led me to believe that many things in our big world are unexplainable. Anyhow, I digress. Part of working the caves means giving tours, and doing this day after day can become monotonous quickly. Tourists are always asking the same questions, and we are always giving out the same answers over and over. Rinse and repeat. But I always try to be engaging and help people understand. So, on this day, it was a Tuesday and the second tour I had given that morning. I had a relatively large group of people. Part of the group was a family of 3, mom, dad, and a girl about the age of 10. The family was relatively quiet, but seemed engaged throughout the tour. Of course, the cave comes with its own set of legends. Some of these are spirits that haunt the cave, but I never gave this much thought. I never even considered that there was such a thing as a real ghost. I always felt that ghosts were a bunch of hoopla created by people just wanting to believe. I would, of course, tell the stories in the hope of engaging my audience, but I had never seen anything to make me believe that there was any truth to it. As I led my group to the haunted chamber within the cave, I noticed the temperature had changed. The temperature change seemed odd because the cave keeps a consistent 54 degrees once inside and away from the entrance. Over my time working within the cave system, I had become accustomed to the temperature. As I began speaking to the group, the internal light system glitched. The lights were not going off, but they were dimming. The lights dimming was unusual. During this, I glanced at the family standing before me to the right. The daughter suddenly pitched forward like someone had shoved her from behind. Her dad's quick reflexes saved her from a complete fall. I asked if she was okay, and she said someone had just pushed her. But her family was to the side, and no one was behind any of them. I checked that she was okay and had my partner continue with the group while I attended to this family. As I leaned down in front of the girl, I could hear rocks shuffling behind her. Then small stones about the size of driveway gravel began rolling. The ground was unlevel in this chamber section, but not enough for the previously undisturbed stones to move. I told the family we should catch up with the group as we had fallen a bit behind. As we exited the chamber, I saw someone's back as they rounded a rock outcropping. Thinking that this was another tour member trying to be funny, I quickly headed over to them to get them back on the path. But guess what, Lilith? There was nothing. No one was there. The entire room was empty, but for me. There was nowhere that anyone could have hidden or gone to escape. I was nervous, anxious, and a little sick at this point. I quickly caught up to the group, and luckily we were at the end of the tour. I took the rest of the day off to think about it all and catch myself. I was trying to relax and think through it all, but in the end, I even debated returning to work the next day. I'm unsure if it was the girl, time we were there, or me. I have no idea, but I do know that there is something truly supernatural inside Mammoth Cave. You can believe me on this one. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. Thanks, Jason. In the middle of summer last year, my friend Sam and I decided to head out on a big adventure. We both loved the outdoors and enjoyed exploring new places. We chose Yellowstone National Park for our next big journey. This huge park, over 2 million acres, is right in the heart of America and has loads of trails and wildlife to see. For several months, we planned our trip carefully. We spent a lot of time looking at maps, checking the weather to choose the best days for our adventure, and getting all of our camping and hiking gear ready. We didn't just want to see the popular parts of the park. We were excited to explore areas that were less crowded and wilder. With our backpacks filled with essentials, we set off for our adventure on the morning of July 20th. Even the drive to Yellowstone's breathtaking. We marveled at the sight of towering mountains and sprawling meadows along the way, our anticipation growing with every mile. Once we reached the park, we felt like we had stepped into a new world. We could hear birds singing, the rustling of leaves as small animals scampered around, and the gentle sound of a river flowing in the distance. The sun was shining brightly, adding to the beauty of Yellowstone's landscapes. We spent the day exploring, walking along trails lined with towering trees and vibrant wildflowers, and taking in the awe-inspiring sights around us. As the day turned into evening, we chose to venture into a less explored path that seemed intriguing. It was one of our goals to take a nighttime hike. As it got darker, the sounds of the park were changing. The friendly chatter of birds was replaced by quiet whispers of the nighttime forest. The park that had seemed so inviting during the daylight hours now felt more mysterious. Suddenly, we heard a strange rustling sound. Turning around, we saw a silhouette standing about 6 feet tall. Its face was hidden, but 2 large, glowing red eyes stared at us. The figure had huge wings, covered in black feathers, reminding us of the wings of a bat. We felt a wave of fear wash over us as we stood there watching it. This was the beginning of an encounter we would never forget. Our exciting night hike was about to become an unforgettable adventure. As we stared in fascination, the creature seemed to become aware of our presence. It twitched, its wings rustling with an eerie whisper that echoed in the stillness of the twilight. We could feel our hearts pounding like frantic drumbeats, echoing our growing fear. The creature shifted, its red eyes flaring brighter for a moment as if reflecting some unknown emotion. Then it slowly spread its wings, revealing their true, massive scale. They were as large as the creature's body, and even in the dim light, we could see they were covered in an array of sleek black feathers, glistening as they caught the last light of the setting sun. Every instinct screamed at us to turn around, to run and put as much distance as we could between ourselves and this intimidating figure. Sam, always the courageous one, fumbled with the camera, trying to focus on the creature while keeping his hands as steady as possible. Sam's fingers danced over the camera as he tried to take a picture. A shiver of anticipation ran through us both as he prepared to capture the unknown entity standing before us. The air seemed to crackle with electricity as the tension mounted. With his eyes still locked onto the creature, Sam adjusted the lens, his breath stopping as he calibrated the focus. I held my breath too, praying that the creature wouldn't make a sudden move. The few moments it took for Sam to steady his hands felt like an eternity. The eerie silence around us broken only by the sound of our own anxious breaths. Finally, Sam snapped the photo. The flash illuminated the clearing, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around the creature. For a heart-stopping second, the creature seemed to freeze, the reflective red of its eyes glowing fiercely in the sudden burst of light. To our surprise, the creature didn't recoil or flee. Instead, it began to unfurl its wings, stretching them wide until they were fully extended. The sight was mesmerizing, as though we had been thrust into the pages of a fantasy novel. We could see the feathers in greater detail now, glistening like polished obsidian under the residual glow of the camera flash. Suddenly, it moved. It took a step forward and we could feel a jolt run through the ground beneath our feet. The power and grace of the creature were palpable, making the air around us feel heavy. Then, with a gust of wind that kicked up leaves and sent them spiraling into the air, it ascended, its mighty wings beating against the cool evening air. We watched, awestruck, as the creature was swallowed up by the darkening sky. As the creature disappeared from sight, Sam and I stood in silence, our eyes still fixed on the spot where the creature had been. What we'd just witnessed was beyond our wildest imagination. Slowly, the sounds of the forest started to return. An owl hooted in the distance, crickets began their evening chorus, and the wind rustled the leaves once again. But the serenity of the park couldn't erase the adrenaline that was still rushing through our veins. We stood there for a few more minutes, half expecting the creature to return, but all that was left was the echo of its departure and one feather that had fallen during its ascent. It was a sleek, black feather, an undeniable proof of our encounter. The hike back to camp was silent as the images of the encounter kept replaying in our minds. As we sat by the campfire later that night, we talked about the creature, about its incredible wings, its red eyes, and how it had disappeared into the night sky. We realized that we had experienced something extraordinary, something we'd remember for the rest of our lives. And so, our adventure in Yellowstone National Park turned out to be much more than a regular hiking trip. It turned out to be a journey into the unknown and a testament to the wonders that nature holds. I was working as a wrangler for a dude ranch out in Utah. I was only there for one season, and that was specifically due to this incident. There's no way was I going back there, not after what I saw. If you don't know how dude ranches work, basically we babysit tourists, stick them on very quiet horses, and lead them on trail rides around scenic places in the desert. There are 2 wranglers per group when we go out. One who rides in the front and one at the very back. We all live on site at the ranch, so we're responsible for the barn chores too. We rotate who does chores in accordance with our trail rides each day. To keep things easy for scheduling, our chore shifts are always with our riding partner unless somebody is sick. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but it was still a pretty cool job. I got to work outdoors all summer and ride horses through some awesome places. But as I found out, the desert isn't a place you want to mess around. There are things living out there that shouldn't be. I don't know if they're demons or monsters or something supernatural. I know the natives are pretty careful about those kinds of things. They've known about them for centuries. There are some places in the desert that the natives won't set foot. The night that it happened started out normally. I had 2 different hour-long trail rides scheduled in the morning with my partner Katie. We had a few hours off in the afternoon, and then we were scheduled for chores later that evening. The weather was weird that day. It was uncharacteristically humid and clouding up like it was going to rain, but it never did. Katie had gotten a pretty bad migraine towards the end of the first ride that morning. She stuck it out for the second ride since we needed 2 people out there, but she looked pretty rough by the end of it. So I told her to get some rest and I could do evening chores myself. We got a weather alert that a thunderstorm was headed our way, so I started feeding the horses a little earlier than usual. It was clouding up and the sky got dark and heavy with the imminent rainfall. There were lightning strikes off in the distance, but I thought I could finish feeding before the storm hit. I finished up in the barn and headed back to my cabin. I was about to start raining at any moment, but I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I turned around to see what it was and was surprised to see a horse standing on the outside of the pasture. I was sure I had all the horses accounted for, but there are a few easy keepers that don't need to come in for grain at night. I figured it was one of them. I wasn't sure how it got out since all the gates were closed, and I knew there weren't any breaks in the fencing. Although I did make a note to check the full length of the fence the next day, I grabbed a halter and went out to catch it and bring it back, hopefully before the rain started. The horse was just standing there. It wasn't moving or eating. It was light gray in color, almost white. Something wasn't right. We only have a couple of horses that color, and this one didn't look like any of them. The nearest ranch was miles away, and there weren't any wild mustangs in the area either. Something deep in the pit of my stomach told me to turn around and get back inside. But if this really was one of our horses, I didn't want to leave it out there, especially with a storm coming. I approached the animal, and as I did, I was overcome by a horrific smell, like something rotten or dead. The horse turned its attention onto me. If I wasn't scared before, I certainly was then. It had a look in its eyes that was predatory, something you don't see in horses, ever. The storm was coming in fast and the wind picked up. If you know anything about horses, you know they can be sensitive to weather changes. Usually when the weather gets like this, they get a little flightier and more panicked. This horse was unnaturally still. The wind whipped its mane and tail around while it stood there like a statue. The smell got worse as I made my way closer to the horse. Maybe it was injured and had an infection brewing. I wasn't sure. It was hard to keep myself from gagging. I knew this wasn't one of our horses. It must have escaped and wandered here. Still, I wanted to catch it and put it up in the barn until we could figure out where it belonged, but the voice in my head told me to run back inside. There was something terribly wrong. The horse's eyes were fixated on me. I took another couple of steps forward and I realized the horse actually didn't have eyes at all. Just two black empty sockets. And yet, it appeared to be able to see me. I started walking backwards. I didn't want to take my eyes off it, but I knew I had to get out of there. The sky grew darker and darker at each passing moment. Then there was a huge thunderclap that rattled the ground and the horse didn't even budge. And then there was a flash of lightning that lit up the whole sky. It was only a quick moment, but the lightning showed the creature's true identity. Its skin clung to its bones with barely any flesh underneath. Large, open, weeping wounds covered its body. It was missing huge sections of skin, and the exposed tissues looked gangrenous. That was where the smell was coming from. I saw its eyes in that flash of light. They were golden, amber-colored like the eyes of a wolf. Rain started to fall, and the creature became a simple, gray horse once again. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, but another lightning strike proved me wrong. The creature now started walking towards me, and I started backing up. I waved the rope I had in my hand, but that didn't deter the creature in the slightest. A normal horse would have reacted to that, but I already knew this thing wasn't a normal horse. I had a metal hoof pick that I kept on my belt. It's something all of us had to carry on trail rides in case one of the horses got something stuck in their foot. I took the pick off my belt, and the creature stopped walking towards me. I guess maybe it thought I was going to put up a fight. I walked backwards all the way to the door of my cabin. I was too afraid to run, and I didn't want to take my eyes off it. Soon as I made it inside, I ran to the window only to find that the creature was gone. To this day, I still have no idea what it was. I'm thinking maybe a wendigo, or maybe even a thunderbird disguised as a horse. But that doesn't really make sense. To be honest, I'm still totally confused about it and can't come up with an answer. If you have any thoughts on this, please let me know. It was a chilly night in Colorado back in 1987. I had just wrapped up a session with a client and I was locking up the office for night. As a psychologist, I have studied every aspect of the human brain and its functions, particularly those affecting behavior. My particular specialty is in developmental psychology, which allows me to see a wide range of patients from infants to adults. In all my years of training and research, I have never seen anything so unreal, so disturbing as what was waiting for me in the alleyway that night. My keys clanged loudly in the stillness of the night. I remember there was a strange mist rolling in, and the moon was shining down. After the door to my office was securely locked, I slid the keys into my pocket and started walking to my little red sedan that was just around the corner on the other side of the building. I started down the sidewalk and froze when I heard metal collide against metal. For some reason, I'm not honestly sure why, perhaps propelled by my own foolish curiosity, I turned to glance over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. Fear is a funny thing. It can take even the most intelligent people and turn them into curious fools. I remember walking toward it. At first, I thought it was a stray dog, rummaging through the garbage cans in search of food. Being more of a cat person myself, I was disgusted with the behavior. But I thought I might simply shoo it away. I continued toward the canine with extreme caution. Having been bitten by a neighbor's dog as a young child, I was slightly fearful. And for good reason. The average bite force of a canine is roughly 230 to 250 psi. I remember researching it shortly after the attack. I suspect it had more to do with me smelling like my kitten than anything else. Animals usually loved me. Despite having one bad experience, I didn't hate dogs. I just preferred cats. But the head that whipped up to look at me from the round metal can was anything but dangerous. It had a squarish face, chestnut in color with a shock of white in between a pair of mesmerizing yellow eyes. 2 floppy ears stood partially erect on both sides of its head. The nose was jet black on the end of a stubby snout. I've never been very good at identifying dog breeds, but this one was definitely a pit bull. It appeared so similar to the one that had bitten me as a child. I could never forget that face. I stepped forward a bit and was now much closer to it. Maybe a good 7 feet away when suddenly the dog tipped itself upright onto its back legs and I saw a human torso on its upper body. The creature was presumably male given the chest hair and build. He was tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet high. The muscles and rib cage were well defined, and I found my own brain bumbling for a logical explanation to the existence of such a beast. When my mind couldn't figure it out, I simply screamed. I didn't mean to be so loud. The scream itself must have echoed for miles. The creature then let out a loud howl. It was an awful sound. Sort of like a human dying a brutal death mixed with some sort of pit bull vocal cords. I thought I was going to die. It was logical to assume an impending attack was inevitable. As I ran in fright, I stumbled over my feet. My hands caught the brunt of my weight as I hit the ground. I felt my skin opening as I slid across the rough ground between the buildings. The creature slowly approached me, well balanced on his hind legs. It was the strangest sight I had ever seen. From the midsection down, the human torso became that of a dog again. Genetically, the whole makeup was wrong. It forced me to question everything I had been taught in school. As its massive head drew nearer to mine, I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the worst. My muscles tensed all throughout my body. I felt my heart rate begin to race in my chest. Then, much to my horror, I felt hot breath on my face. But when I opened my eyes, the creature was nowhere. What was mostly odd about it is that despite the silence, I didn't even hear him leave. I glanced around, but there was no other sign of life. For a few moments, I attempted to wrap my brain around the experience. Logically, I couldn't formulate a conclusion. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But without allowing myself to think too much, I pushed myself up to my feet and ran as fast as I could to my vehicle. And let me tell you, that was quite a feat to pull off in high heels. I was lucky neither heel broke as I rushed to my car. Could I be certain the creature wouldn't come back for me? I couldn't. And I knew it had been hungry, so I hated to think of the possibility there. Anyway, I wasn't sticking around to find out what might happen. I pulled the door shut and locked it securely. Then I jammed my keys into the ignition and flipped the car in reverse and shot out of the parking lot. I never looked back. I've heard some of the stories you read from members of the military. I can confirm that crazy stuff happens on deployment, but I would argue that sometimes even crazier stuff happens on base. Most of the time, the rules of conduct keep us in line, but if they don't, the fear of your staff sergeant does. But even then, human nature means that soldiers can get into fights or have problems with other people in their work assignments. I was stationed at a certain base in New Mexico. It's famous for building a big bomb. I'm sure you can figure it out, and is currently tasked with military research. But after the wow factor of being on such a historically important posting wore off, I realized that everything else about working there was the same as any other base. Same guard duty, same jobs, same rules and regulations. I still had to pass my physicals. Actually, that's where it was a little weird because military regulations are strict when it comes to weight and fitness levels. But this posting was even more strict about physical fitness. I mean, we were in good shape in the military, but we were in really good shape when we were stationed at this particular base. Even the engineering specialists, such as myself. It wasn't uncommon to see soldiers putting more effort in on their PT. The weight room was always crowded. The joke was that we had to work to stay in shape because the food was pretty decent. What can I say? If there's one area of any military establishment that gets a lot of criticism, it's the commissary. But this one did us right. The specialists behind the counter knew their way around their supplies. It wasn't like they were miraculously Italian grandmothers, but the food was hot, tasted good, and was identifiable, so no complaints. That's why it was so weird when I saw a soldier in the hotline getting agitated over something. He was standing about 4 people ahead of me, close enough that I could see his expression when he turned around. He wasn't kidding around. He looked really angry. I watched him as he stalked off to a table at the far end of the mess hall. He looked like he was calming down some, so I relaxed a little and went back to waiting for my turn to get chow. But I was still curious about what had happened, so when it was my turn to get served, I asked. The culinary specialist behind the counter shrugged and told me the soldier had asked for beef, which they weren't serving. I have to be honest, that confused me even more. Beef? He was mad about them not having beef. I figured he was just having a bad day, that his CEO would sort his attitude out and everything would be fine. It wasn't until I grabbed lunch the next day that I found out how wrong I was. I got in earlier than I usually do, so I was already sitting down when that soldier from yesterday came in with a few others. Probably the same platoon. I guess the specialist had told the chefs that slabs of cow were a thing because there were burgers available for lunch. I figured the guy would be happy to get it, and he was. But as he sat down, I noticed the other soldiers he'd come in with all had burgers too. There was something, I don't know, off. Maybe it was the way they hunched over their trays. They all seemed almost protective of their food. If that sounds weird to you, I promise you it was 10 times weirder to see. But as these guys all looked like they took their PT standards very, very seriously, I chalked it up to the kind of health regimen an engineer like me didn't care too much about, until that first soldier started growling. I'm not exaggerating. One of his buddies leaned a little close to his food, and the guy honestly growled at him. Now, I'm familiar with the term hangry. This wasn't something you'd see on base, or anywhere in the military, because we have this little thing called military discipline, and getting into a fight over a cheeseburger isn't allowed. But that's exactly what happened. One second somebody was growling, the next second there was an all-out brawl at that table. This wasn't some high school lunchroom fight. This was several trained combat veterans legitimately trying to hurt each other very, very badly. And what made it even weirder was how silent they were. Most of the time when there's a fight, there are insults. Yelling. These guys? Nothing. Nothing but grunts when fists landed, and the cracking of bone when someone's knuckles landed in the sweet spot to break a nose. And then it got weirder. A Sarge burst into the room like he was teleporting through sheer vengeance and ran over to that fight. Now, most of the time, DI or staff sergeant has to do is yell. They weaponize their lung capacity, but they usually use that power for the good of the armed forces, and everybody falls in line. This sergeant? He growled. Now, I have to admit, I have heard my drill instructor growl at me when I first joined up, but not like this. This didn't even sound human. It was so low in his chest. It was an absolutely primal sound, and it worked, because every single one of those soldiers froze and fell into line immediately. They didn't even bother to wipe at the blood running down their faces. That fight had been more serious than I'd first thought. At least one of those men looked like someone had clawed at his face. Guess he was lucky we all had to keep short nails because those finger trails looked nasty, red and raw and bleeding. The rest of us, we just watched it all happen. What were we supposed to do? It didn't matter how weird this whole thing was. There was a Sarge on scene and he was in charge. And if you think any of us were going to question him, you've never been in the military. The sergeant had those rounded up and filing out of the commissary in record time. I got a good look at their faces as they marched out. Their eyes were weird, pupils were blown wide, and they honestly looked like they couldn't focus. That first soldier who'd growled was the one with the broken nose. Maybe it was the pain, but his eyes looked bloodshot. They were incredibly red. Too red. I don't have an explanation for what happened that day, but I do know two things. Our facility also researches theoretical biology, and the next time I saw that particular squad, every one of them looked like they could bench press a Volkswagen. Like I said, we took our PT seriously, but it should have been impossible for them to bulk up that much in 2 weeks. Did I also mention they also looked like they grew at least 3 inches taller? That squad shipped out not long after that, and I'd been in the military too long to think that asking questions was a good idea, so I didn't. But I still haven't forgotten. And if they haven't been killed in combat yet, there's still a squad of freakishly tough soldiers on active duty out there. Somewhere. I used to be a ranger in Kentucky and handled quite a variety of duties over the course of my time there. At one point, part of my job was to keep the recreational shooting sports range operating. I grew up in a family that liked to shoot and hunt, so my dad had trained me to know what I was doing around guns. I really geek out about firearms, and I have a bit of an obsession with maintaining them and using them responsibly. I'd lived in Kentucky my whole life, and my family's land was nearby to the national forest where I worked. My family owns 20 acres of land, so I liked to go out there when I was practicing. I had purchased a new rifle and needed to sight in my gun after I bought it. I'd gotten a drum magazine and I wanted to test out its reliability. My family had owned that land for decades. Nothing weird had ever happened out there that I knew of. I'd taken people to that spot plenty of times. I had the brand new magazine and hadn't had a chance to use it yet. I grabbed my gun, the drum, and 20 rounds of ammo and went to the field I liked to use. To get to the field, I had to go through a barbed wire fence and a few hundred feet of wooded area. It was an unnaturally cold day. As soon as I crossed over the barbed wire, something felt off. I'd been there 1,000 times, and like I said, I'd never had any weird experiences. But something felt really strange that day. I kept going though because I thought I was being paranoid or the wind and air pressure were just right to give an eerie feeling. So I walked on deeper into the woods. The further I got, the stronger the feeling was. I got halfway there and the feeling was getting pretty intense. I hadn't loaded my ammo into the magazine yet because I wanted to hurry and get to the field so I could get everything set up. I stopped dead in my tracks and loaded the magazine with the 20 rounds I brought. Things were weird, and I felt like I needed to be ready, just in case. Then out of nowhere, I smelled something dead. I'd been standing there for a few minutes with no scent when all of a sudden it smelled like a month-old rotting carcass was beside me. I looked around, and there behind me, I saw a mangled animal. Aside from the smell, it looked nearly fresh. It was so mangled, though, so it was hard to tell what it even was. It was a white-gray color. I thought it was a rabbit or a possum. but I couldn't stop thinking about how the smell didn't go along with the freshness of the carcass. Whatever the stench was, it wasn't coming from that animal, I thought. I finished loading the magazine and stuck it in my gun. I held the bolt open so that if I tripped, the gun wouldn't fire accidentally. I was nearly out of the thick woods and could see the field I was heading to. It was straight ahead. The whole time up until now, I'd been walking alongside the creek. The creek turns to the left as you approach the field. As I got to the turn in the creek, I heard a loud splash in the water. I turned around, and what I saw, I'll never forget. This thing was easily 8 feet tall and was standing on 2 legs. And other than the water splash, it was dead silent. The creature had very long arms and long legs. It was light brown, like a grayish brown. It didn't look like fur, though, more like skin, but the skin was really bedraggled and hanging off of it. It looked severely malnourished. It was incredibly skinny, and the skin was tight across its body. Imagine taking a fully grown man that only weighs 120 pounds and stretching him out to be 8 feet tall. It had an odd walk too, but that could have been caused by the mud near the creek bed. It never faced me, so I didn't get a chance to see its front. It just kept walking and never turned around. I think the freakiest thing about it was its size. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I tried to close the bolt on my gun to chamber around, just in case it turned around to fight. I had no intention of shooting unless it gave a sign it was going to attack. But when I tried to chamber around, the magazine wouldn't let go of the round. The force of the bolt closing would break your finger if you were to close it on your finger. I had been loading and unloading the magazine the day before to help loosen the spring to make it easier to load in the future. I could take the rounds out with my hand, but when I came across this terrifying creature, somehow, the gun decides it wants to hold on to the freaking bullet. By now, the thing was out of my sight, and I was just standing there feeling defenseless. I have no idea what that thing was, but all I can do is thank God it walked away from me. The weird thing was, I had no doubt in my mind that it was something not of this world, and it's not like me to think like that. It felt like something almost supernatural. I never saw that thing again, but I always felt really paranoid in that area after that. Lesson learned, always be prepared. I was walking home from work at about 11 p.m. one night. I lived at the end of a road just outside of town that had no streetlights, and it was fairly dark out that night. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness at that point, and luckily I could see well enough to walk without tripping over anything. I live in Oak Grove, South Carolina, which is just to the west of Columbia. The area beyond where I live is mostly undeveloped woods with patches of farmland. At least it used to be that way until they started building houses on every available lot several years ago. I guess people need places to live while working in the city, but I hated it. The good thing is, though, there's not much crime here, just the occasional occurrence of a car break-in or vandalism. Anyway, this particular night seemed a bit odd. I can't really tell you why, but something about it just seemed off. Like I wasn't as comfortable walking home as I normally would be. So, just to calm my mind, I stopped walking and listened, so see if anything seemed strange. I remember thinking that it must have just been my imagination playing with me. I walked on for a few more minutes, and that's when I noticed something dog-sized and shaped like a dog sitting on top of the rusting remains of a cover for an old well. The shape seemed to be looking my way, even watching me intently, but it stayed where it was. I'm pretty sure I even heard it letting out a low growl every now and then. Obviously, the dog's growls made me nervous, so I picked up my pace, trying to stay just ahead of whatever it was. But this turned out to be difficult. What happened was that even though I had passed by the area where it had been sitting, the animal stood up and began to follow me at an incredibly fast rate, much faster than it should have been able to move. For the next few minutes, it continued following me while occasionally snarling and snapping at me. I tried to hurry my pace and outrun it. I knew that I was no match for the dog if it decided to attack, so then I ran as fast as my legs could go. Finally, I reached the safety of my back porch, got in the house, and slammed and locked the sliding glass door behind me. The dog creature was nowhere to be seen now, but I could still hear its sounds in the distance, growling. Was it going to break into my house and eat me? I was still breathing hard when the phone in my pocket started vibrating loudly. It scared me a little bit, and I felt my heart skip a few beats. I fumbled for the phone and answered it in a shaky voice. Hello? Hey, check this out. I'm at the end of your road now. It was my friend Sean who was on his way to my house to hang out. He continued talking, unaware that I was still trying to catch my breath. And there is this creature crouching. I could hear him chuckle as he said it. There's this dog sitting on the side of the road, like watching me. It's huge. Like seriously, something looks to be wrong with it. It's like half dog and half human. I'm gonna try and get a picture of it. Just a sec while I open the camera and get closer. The thought of Sean getting closer to that thing was terrifying, but before I could say anything, he continued talking, and it sounded like he had the camera on and was talking to the creature. And that's when I heard Sean yell. Next, I heard what sounded like breaking glass and a thud, followed by Sean screaming. I panicked, thinking that he had been attacked by the creature. Our phones were still connected, but now there was no sound coming through to me at all. I decided I had no choice but to head outside and try to find Sean to see what happened to him. That's when I saw the creature sitting right next to Sean's car, making a strange clicking sound with its throat. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, hunched over like an ape but covered in thick black fur. It was terrifying to look at. I could see that Sean was still in the driver's seat, but his phone was laying outside the car on the street. The creature must have smashed through his window and thrown it off to the side. I decided that if I could get to the car, then maybe I would have a chance of getting Sean to focus and drive away from there. Everything happened so fast and I had no time to react. Suddenly, the thing stood up straight and gave a disturbing, deep growl. Its head was facing towards my direction, so I started running as fast as I could to get inside the car. I felt like it was right behind me when I reached the door and jumped inside. Go! I yelled to Sean, who luckily slammed his foot on the accelerator and peeled out of there. Later, I asked him why in the world he thought it would be a good idea to stop and take a picture of something so terrifying. He told me that never in a million years did he suspect that he had come across an actual cryptid. He thought it was just some old mangy dog or a trick of the light making it look like it was half human. These days, we don't really talk about it ever. It just seems like we've both forgotten about it. Or maybe it's just that we're too scared to bring it up and say it out loud. That has to be what it is. We're just too scared. Because I can tell you for certain that I haven't forgotten about it one bit. Every town has its stories. And our town, nestled in the craggy arms of the Rocky Mountains, has a story that sends shivers down my spine even today. It's about my encounter with a creature. I am Bill, an old hand in these parts, and the tale I am about to share is a bone-chilling one. Our town, with its beautiful landscapes and thriving forests, is a paradise for those who love the wild. It's a peaceful place, a hidden jewel where one can truly appreciate the majesty of nature. But it is also home to an old cabin where one of the first settlers of our area used to live. This cabin, abandoned for years, is an important piece of our history, and as the town historian, it was my duty to preserve it. My motivation was not only my job, but a genuine fascination and love for the mysteries of the past. It was July 2nd, a balmy summer evening in 2019. I planned to document some aspects of the cabin's interior. The old, weathered wood and history-filled rooms always filled me with a sense of purpose. The cabin was an easy hike outside of town along a path into the forest. But as I reached it that day, I instantly knew something was off. A smell hit me, a strange mix of scents. A smell that was new to me, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the cabin's age, and continued inside. I was engrossed in my work, and hours rolled by. But eventually, I heard it. A low growl, almost like a murmur on the wind. It was distant, but noticeable. It was eerie, but at the time I only paused a second before I dismissed it as an animal in the forest. A few more moments passed when suddenly I felt a chill run down my spine. The sense of being watched. My skin prickled and I turned to see an 8-foot-tall creature standing upright in the doorway of the cabin. Its body was a bizarre mix. It had the legs of a dog, but with wide shoulders and a big chest. A hump on its back gave it a monstrous silhouette. The face was demonic, more hyena than human, with a long snout and a double row of teeth visible even in the dim light. I froze. I could see its dark brown, almost black hair slicked against its body. And those eyes, they seemed to glow in the darkness with a cruel gleam lurking in them. The dilemma I faced was grave. Do I run or do I stand my ground? It was then that my survival instincts kicked in. I moved slowly, inching my way towards the back door. My heart pounded in my chest like a jackhammer, each beat echoing in my ears. Sweat trickled down my brow and I blinked to clear the salty sting from my eyes. I was acutely aware of every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I moved slowly backwards, each creak seeming to shout my presence to the creature. It was watching me with an unnerving stillness. Its low growling hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a twig snapping outside the cabin behind the creature. The creature's ears perked up, and it turned its attention away from me for just a moment. Seizing the opportunity, I lunged towards the door, grasping the rusted knob in my hand. The creature spun back around, its eyes flashing ominously. Panic surged through me as I pulled at the door, my heart sinking when it didn't budge. It was stuck. Desperate, I threw my shoulder against the wooden barrier, the impact jarring my bones. Once, twice, and on the third time the door flew open with a loud groan. I tumbled outside and landed on the ground. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back as I sprinted towards the tree line. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, sound echoing through the night air, resonating in my very soul. Behind me, the cabin loomed ominously, and I just kept running. As I disappeared into the woods, a breathless prayer of thanks escaped my lips. I was alive. As I weaved through the trees, I could still hear the creature's howls in the distance. I didn't stop running until I was well away from the cabin. I trudged towards the town, but I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Was the creature following me? I dared not look back, fearing that I would see its ominous figure emerging from the shadows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stepped onto the paved road leading into town. The streetlights overhead cast pools of light onto the ground, guiding my way. I approached the police station. As I pushed open the door, the cool, air-conditioned interior washed over me. The officer at the desk looked up in surprise, her eyes widening at the sight of me, disheveled, exhausted, and terrified. "I need help," I managed to croak out, my voice hoarse from exertion and fear. Her expression turned serious as she nodded, reaching for the phone. Over the following hours, I narrated my horrific encounter to the police, who listened with grave faces and took copious amounts of notes. As I watched the forest from the safety of the police station, I wondered about the creature. Was it still there, lurking in the shadows? I shuddered at the thought. The ordeal was far from over, and it was clear that our quiet town would never be the same again. But for the moment, I was safe. The creature had been left behind, confined to the darkness of the forest, and I held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could keep it there. I've been a long-time listener and have finally decided to come forward with my own haunted tale. The story takes place in the small town of Ripley, Tennessee, in the summer of 1995. Back then, Ripley was home to a little pet store nestled in a strip mall right off of the highway. I was 16 years old and had just acquired my first job there at the shop. I was excited about working there. I'd loved animals my whole life and was especially fond of unique birds like Amazon parrots, cockatoos, and Indian ringnecks. You know, the talking varieties. Needless to say, on my first day at the store, I was completely enamored when my boss introduced me to a Moluccan cockatoo named Charlie, who presided over the front end of the store. Moluccans are the largest of the cockatoo varieties, and Charlie loved to sit on his perch near the store entrance and welcome people in. All day long, you'd hear him up there squawking happily and saying, "Come on in, friends." I admit, it made for some good marketing. People would come in just to see Charlie, and then they would wind up shopping and buying a few things. What people didn't realize, though, was that Charlie was much smarter than just being able to give a friendly hello now and again. He was also a watcher of things inside the store. Cockatoos are intelligent birds. Not only can they learn to speak like people, but they can understand the meanings of words, learn names, and even carry on short, simple conversations if properly socialized. Charlie was one of those special birds that had developed a knack for conversation. I loved closing up the store in the evenings because it gave me time with Charlie to listen to him gab. He would often go on about the day. He'd squawk and talk about customers he had seen. For example, he once met a little girl in a hat that fed him half of her cookie. That night, hours after seeing her, he was still talking about Hat Kid and the treat. When she came back to the store weeks later with her grandma, he recognized her and called out, "Hi, Hat Girl," and she wasn't even wearing the hat. It was amazing. On my 3rd month there, something tragic happened. One of my coworkers, Derek, was killed in a head-on collision leaving a party. I won't lie and say Derek and I were close. In fact, Derek was probably my least favorite coworker simply because I didn't really understand why he, who clearly hated animals, had chosen to work in a pet store. Derek was a troubled guy. He was rough with animals when he'd kennel them. He was constantly yelling at the animals to shut up, and he could be especially mean to Charlie. When Derek died, the whole store went through the motions of losing one of our own. Of all of us who worked at the shop, though, I was probably the least torn up about it. Don't get me wrong, I felt sad for Derek's life being lost and for his family, but he and I just weren't as close as he was with some of the others. On the day of Derek's funeral, I volunteered to work by myself so the others could have the day off. Even if we didn't open the store, someone would have to come in and feed and clean up after the animals. So on that day, I was all alone at the shop, and all throughout the day, spooky things kept occurring. Locked doors would open out of nowhere. The radio, which I usually kept tuned to the local country station, would suddenly switch over to heavy metal. And the animals all seemed to be more restless than usual. We had 2 Persian kittens in the shop who spent the day huddled in the back of their kennel, hissing toward the front. The Cocker Spaniel puppy, who was normally playful, was trembling and wanting to be held. The reptiles were all hiding under their logs and rocks. Even Charlie seemed off. "It's a bad day," he kept saying. I thought maybe they were all just picking up on the energy of the shop. After all, it was a bad day. It was a sad day. Animals are naturally intuitive and empathetic toward people, right? They probably sensed it. That still didn't explain the doors or the radio or the sound of heavy footsteps across the tile when I knew I was alone, though. I was glad to see closing time coming. I started putting the animals to bed and cleaning up around the shop early. I wanted to get out of the store and home as soon as possible. As always, I left Charlie out of his cage until last. At 7 o'clock, I locked the front doors and carried the tray of food dishes to the back room to wash them before going home for the night. I left Charlie on his perch, as I always did, and the radio was playing my country station. As I started to wash, the radio cut off. It didn't change stations this time. It just cut off. I was in a hurry to get home, though, so I didn't bother going to check out why. The radio had been acting up all day. I wasn't going to fret over it now, but only a minute later, Charlie started screaming. "No Derek," he yelled. "No Derek, no Derek, no Derek, no Derek, no Derek," over and over and over again like a broken record. I ran from the back to the front of the store to see what was going on, and the lights were flickering. Charlie was on his perch, flapping his wings in fear, still screaming, "No Derek, no Derek." And that's when I realized his head was turned to the side and he was staring into the far back corner of the store. I followed his gaze. There, standing in the corner by the tanks, stood Derek, and it looked like blood was pouring from his head. One eye was popped out of his skull, and he was see-through. The lights of the aquarium were visible right through his body. I screamed louder than I think I ever have, and that's when the lights came back on. The country music started playing, and Charlie calmed down. I didn't even finish washing the bowls. I said my goodbyes to Charlie, wrote a note for my boss, and left. And I really mean left. I never went back again. However, I do second guess myself and wonder if it was all just a figment of my imagination or what. What do you think? What I'm writing in to tell you took place in August of 2016 when my family and I were on vacation in Garrison, North Dakota. We had rented a small cabin next to a lake and basically hoped to get off the grid for a week. It was our third day there, and I looked at my watch. It was getting close to midnight, but I couldn't sleep. I needed some fresh air, so I got up and walked outside to the deck that overlooked a small pond in the back of the property. It was pitch black out there, so with the help of the moonlight, I made my way across the deck. When I reached the end overlooking the pond, something caught my eye. At first, all I saw were two big yellowish eyes staring straight back into mine. Then another set of eyes appeared next to them. Both sets were about 20 feet straight in front of me, looking right at me. And then the next thing I saw was a dark, furry creature slowly revealing itself as it stepped out into the light from the porch. The second set of eyes stayed back in the darkness. The creature that came forward had long brown hair covering most of its body. It stood about 7 feet tall, had a large head and a long, snoutish nose. It was brown in color with a white patch on its chest, like a husky. The creature, now standing in the light, continued to look at and follow me as I moved out further onto the deck. And then suddenly it went back into the blackness and joined the second creature, which I now could not see. I thought I must have been hallucinating or dreaming, because I never believed in these types of creatures. Deep down, I felt something telling me this dog thing was more than just an ordinary animal, so obviously I became really cautious. I slowly turned around, made my way back inside the house, and made sure all windows and doors were locked. The next morning, I woke to some really weird sounds coming from outside our bedroom window. It sounded like something was walking around our wooden deck, making a lot of noise. I heard growling or grunting at times, then it stopped. I quickly got up from bed and looked out the sliding glass door. There in front of me, I saw this dog-like creature on its hind legs looking into our bedroom window. And again, with those two big yellow eyes staring right through me, just like earlier that night. Seeing this creature scared the hell out of me so badly that my heart started racing, and I started feeling dizzy, almost as if somebody injected some kind of adrenaline into me. I had to sit down on the closest chair I could find. My wife woke up at that moment and asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer her because I didn't want to scare her by telling her about this thing outside. I just told her that I heard some animal outside our bedroom window making a lot of noise, then it stopped. She looked worried, and so did our kids when they came down the steps after hearing me awake and telling the story. We decided to see if we could see it again, and maybe even get a picture of whatever it was before we called the sheriff's department. Our youngest daughter grabbed my wife's hand and said, "Daddy thinks there's something or somebody out there. I heard him tell you." I looked at her with this half grin, shook my head from side to side, and told her that there was nothing out there. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me after watching some scary movies on television. There was no way I was letting anyone else outside with me, so they stayed back. I was honestly scared to death, but felt I needed to look for this thing to protect my family. A few minutes passed when all of a sudden I saw the two big yellow eyes again in the darkness. Before long, I saw the second set of eyes too. My youngest daughter was making some weird sounds from inside the bedroom, and I swear I heard her saying she saw 3 sets of eyes staring back. I quickly went back inside and told them to just lay down and stop looking out the window. I didn't want them to be scared and more, so I didn't want them to see anything. I told them it's just your imagination, so maybe we all need to go back to bed and get some sleep. "No, Daddy, please, I don't want you to go outside," our youngest daughter said with tears in her eyes. I assured her I'd be fine and headed for the door again. Everyone's eyes were on me as I started walking toward the door that opened out onto the backyard. I slowly turned the lock on the sliding glass door, pressed my body against it as it opened, and listened closely for any strange noises. There were none, so I stepped out onto the deck with a flashlight in one hand and my cell phone in the other, just in case I saw it. I wanted to get a picture. And that's when the creature stepped out of the darkness, but this time started walking in my direction. The creature didn't seem to pay much attention to me at first until it walked right past me, smelling me first, as I stood there petrified, not knowing what to do next. But then it stopped, turned around, looked at me real closely, and growled at me loudly. It was so loud and scary that it made our dog, who was inside the house, start barking like crazy. I knew I had to get away as fast as possible. I ran inside through the sliding glass door, locking it behind me, then went upstairs to check on my wife and daughters. My own dog quickly followed me up the stairs, also looking scared. I looked out their bedroom window once more, trying to see if this creature was still out there, but couldn't spot it anywhere in our backyard or near the fence where we had seen it last. But I could now see that there were plenty of dog-like paw prints out in the yard just outside our bedroom window, where the thing must have stood staring at us earlier. I knew I needed to do something to get rid of this thing once and for all. So I went back downstairs. This time I took a loaded shotgun with me just in case it charged me. To be honest, I didn't have an exact plan in mind, but I certainly felt safer holding the shotgun. I opened the door again and slowly started walking toward where I saw it, but it was nowhere to be seen now. So I continued walking until I got near the dog prints, and that's when I saw it again. It seemed like a dog at first glance, but it wasn't quite right. It was too large with a dark grayish-brown coat that reminded me of an ugly dog we had many years ago. I stopped and pointed my shotgun directly at it and clicked off the safety. This caused it to turn around and growl at me again, staring deep into my soul. It felt like forever, and then it slowly started approaching me. I don't even think it knew what the gun was, and that's when I took one shot into the air above it, hoping he would take off. I didn't want to kill him, and I was pretty sure he was just scared and confused. But this dog thing didn't even flinch when the gun went off. He kept on coming toward me, growling so loud now that it sounded like a freight train going right past my ears, and all of a sudden, it started running as fast as it could. In a flash, and to my surprise, he charged past me. I spun around to see where he was headed and realized that he was charging straight for my dog that was still in the house barking like crazy. What happened next caught me totally by surprise. The thing stopped mid-run, did a 180 and took off in the opposite direction. I kept watching as it ran off into the distance until it disappeared. I slowly turned back to my dog, who was still barking like crazy inside the house. I went inside without saying a word, locked all the doors, and called the police because I just knew that this creature thing could and probably would come back sooner or later. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, we told them everything that had happened. They took a report, but I honestly felt that they didn't believe a word I said. And once they left, saying they would write up the report and be in touch with any questions, we hunkered down for the night, hoping that nothing would come back anytime soon. In the morning, we packed up and left. I live in the Northeast, in Massachusetts. When I was a student, I volunteered in my local library on Saturdays to get some work experience. This was an enjoyable job and one that I truly did enjoy. It was an old library that had been built in the 1800s, so all the architecture was old and Gothic. Apparently, at one point, it was used as a prison for suspected witches and black magic practitioners. There was an ancient and spooky feeling in the library. But for me, it was a fascinating place to work. On one occasion, however, my last shift, ever to be exact, I encountered something terrifying. As I did our end-of-day checks on the premises, it was up to myself and a colleague to ensure that all users had left the premises. I went to check on the bathrooms. We had a recurring problem in which people would try to hide in there to spend the night in the library. So I was slightly anxious about doing this and hoping not to find anyone. As I walked inside the women's room to check it first, I heard a growling or a grunting noise. It was unusual, and I assumed that somebody had passed out or fallen asleep in the bathroom stall. When I opened the door, I saw the strange being. It appeared to be like a short person, kind of like this disgusting ogre, but imagine it being more like an imp. At least, I guess that's what you'd call them. It was only about a foot or two high with black skin and pointed ears. It literally looked a little demon. In that moment, I was petrified and terrified at what I was looking at. This thing was staring right at me, and I wondered if it would strike out at me thinking that I was a threat. But it remained passive and stared at me with these small, beady black eyes. I attempted to call for my colleague, but my voice was so faint. Nothing happened. Within seconds, this creature or being just evaporated. Like that, it was just gone. It dematerialized in the air. My colleague came in looking confused and wondering what I wanted. She saw that I was completely terrified and confused and pulled me out of there, not knowing what had happened. I've thought about it a lot. I feel that whatever I saw got scared, and maybe it's some sort of demon or a shapeshifter. I don't know. Earlier that day, a customer had actually reported seeing this unusual bird that flew into the library and just sat there on the stacks for hours. I mean, if that's what it really was. A bird. Then again, maybe that bird was a messenger of some sort. Anyway, it is fascinating that such things of the paranormal still exist here. Due to all the witch and black magic practitioners that existed here at one point, I wonder if there's any connection between the two. My name is Joan, and I am a park ranger with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife Parks. I've spent the better part of 2 decades working in some of the most rugged and remote terrains across the state. In my line of work, I've come across every imaginable kind of wildlife. I've seen them all. I know their habits, their behaviors, their little quirks. You see, a good park ranger doesn't just watch over the land, they understand it. They can tell when an animal's been through the area, when a storm's brewing, and when something's just not right. And that's why this particular incident stands out, because despite my extensive experience, this was something I had never encountered before, something that defied everything I knew about the wilderness. It was in the summer of 2022 that I had my encounter. The location was a remote part of the Flathead National Forest, a rugged landscape carved out by glaciers and dominated by towering pine and fir trees. This expansive wilderness spans over 2 million acres and is teeming with wildlife, making it a personal favorite for both its biodiversity and its solitude. The area is a rugged maze of dense forests, deep valleys, and high ridges with sparse trail access. The green canopy is often broken by crystal clear streams that snake their way down the mountains, offering a lifeline to a multitude of creatures that call this place home. Nestled away from any semblance of civilization, you'd be hard-pressed to find any human tracks here. The area is so remote that it would take a couple of days of hard hiking to reach the nearest outpost. It's the kind of isolation that gives you a sense of being the only person on the planet, with nature undisturbed and going about its business as it has done for millennia. I was there on an overnight trip outside of work just to see the area. With my tent set up in a secluded clearing, I spent the daylight hours scouting for signs of animal activity. The imprints of paw on the damp ground, scratch marks on tree barks, and subtle disturbances in the foliage all gave me clues about the animals in the area. As the sun began to set, I settled into a comfortable position against a large tree, camera ready, waiting for the nocturnal nature to unfold. The forest was alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a deer moved in the undergrowth, the distant call of a coyote. The first thing I noticed was an abrupt silence that swept over the forest. It wasn't the quiet that descends with nightfall. No, this was an unsettling stillness, kind of hush that settles in when a predator is nearby. As a park ranger, you learn to trust your instincts, and right then my instincts were sounding an alarm. Something wasn't right. I quietly reached for my flashlight and began scanning the surrounding forest, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The trees cast long shadows that danced and flickered as I moved the light. That's when I noticed the second sign. Despite the chill of the evening, the temperature around me seemed to drop rapidly, a wave of icy coldness that made me shiver. It was in this ominous silence and bone-chilling cold that I picked up on the third, and by far the most disturbing indication, that something was profoundly wrong. The smell. The smell hit me next, a gut-wrenching stench that filled the air. It was dense and almost tangible. It It was a smell I was all too familiar with, the smell of death, but magnified several times over. It was the smell of decay, of rotting flesh. As a park ranger, I've encountered dead animals before, but this was a smell like none other. It was so strong, it felt like a physical presence, making my stomach churn and my eyes water. Despite the chill, a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I quickly covered my nose with the collar of my jacket, but the scent seemed to permeate everything, clinging to my clothes, my skin, filling my nostrils. In the heavy silence, a sound rang out, a deep, low growl that seemed to reverberate through the forest. The growl was unlike anything I'd ever heard, devoid of any sense of life or vigor. It was a primal, guttural sound that seemed to resonate with the chilling smell of decay that still hung in the air. As I tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound, my flashlight beam fell onto a figure a little distance away. My heart pounded in my chest as I took in the sight of the most bizarre creature I'd ever laid eyes on. Standing a good 9 feet tall, the creature towered over the surrounding shrubbery, its silhouette ghostly in the dim light from my flashlight. Its body bore a disturbing semblance to that of an elk, but grotesquely distorted and skeletal. The skin hung loosely from its frame, like it was wearing a suit much too large for its body. What looked like rotting flesh was visible in places, adding to the revolting stench that still hung heavy in the air. Its head was the most disturbing part of its body. It was a grotesque parody of a deer's skull, complete with antlers. Instead of eyes, there were 2 gaping holes, as dark and hollow as the night around us. For a terrifying moment, they lit up with a sickly yellow glow, flickering like twin flames in the darkness before shifting to an eerie red, casting an unholy light in the immediate vicinity. Seeing it, feeling its overwhelming presence, filled me with a sense of dread that I had never experienced before. The air felt heavy, as though charged with some kind of energy that prickled at my skin. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature didn't approach. It just stood there, its ghastly gaze seemingly fixed on me. The forest held its breath with me. The only sounds were of my own heartbeat and the distant, faint howling of the wind. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also something that most people would never experience. In the midst of the fear, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of privilege. It felt like an eternity, that face-off. Finally, after what felt like a stretch of suspended time, the creature finally moved. Despite its grotesque form, it moved with grace, its skeletal frame gliding more than stepping through the undergrowth. It was as though it belonged to the forest. As it turned to leave, the glow in its eye sockets dimmed, then faded, returning to the empty darkness. It disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the shadows. The chilling cold that had enveloped the area started to dissipate, the air slowly warming back to the usual night chill. The eerie silence was broken by the timid chirping of a cricket that slowly gathered strength as more insects joined in. It was as if nature was finally breathing a sigh of relief. I stood there, motionless, my heart still pounding hard. I watched as the last hint of the creature melted into the darkness. It was over. The encounter had ended, leaving me with a racing heart and a memory that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. Before heading out on a camping trip to Utah's Lake Powell, I did some research on the area. I wanted to learn more about what all was around and what I could expect while camping there. What I didn't expect was to find all kinds of information about strange creatures supposedly living in the area. I found one report that claimed strange creatures could be seen frequently around Lake Powell, but most encounters happened further north along Utah's Canyonlands National Park. It was going to be my dad and me, and we had planned to camp right outside of the national park in a campground that was very close to the city of Moab. I was also with my dog, Chewie, who I'd named after the Star Wars character because he looked just like him. Chewie was a brown chow-looking dog that had fallen out of a truck near our house when he was very young, and we have become completely bonded to each other. He and I were now inseparable. That night, after a long day of hiking and exploring, I decided to go for a walk around the campgrounds with Chewy just to see what all was going on. It was probably about 9 p.m. at the time, and other campers were sitting around campfires and cleaning up their sites for the night. As we were walking, Chewy started looking up at the sky and perking his ears. He seemed to be looking at something in particular, something up high. So I looked up too, but couldn't see anything strange. But Chewy continued to stare, and then he started pulling me forward, so I let him lead the way. Soon, I did see something out of the corner of my eye darting between two bushes ahead of us. It looked like a dog, but it was mostly obscured by the bushes. So it could have been anything, really. Still, Chewy seemed to be very interested in whatever it was, so I decided to let him investigate. Maybe he would make friends with another camper's dog. Who knows? We continued along, and it wasn't long before I saw it clear as day. It wasn't a regular dog. It was much bigger than a regular dog would be. It was about the size of a small bear with sharp teeth and long hair that matched its body almost perfectly. It must have heard us approach because it jumped up to face us, baring its teeth and growling. I froze in terror, but Chewy didn't seem to realize that this was something he should be afraid of. He let out a deep growl of his own and lunged towards it. The creature then responded by dropping to all fours and charging us. I was trying to figure out what to do, but managed to run when Chewy barked at me. I ran through our campground screaming for help, trying to get back to our site as soon as possible, with the thing now chasing me and Chewy nipping at its heels. It chased me all the way back to our camper, where it skidded to a stop as soon as it saw my dad. He was standing there watching us run back. My dad had his rifle trained on the creature. I don't know how the thing knew to stop and be afraid of the rifle, but it did. It let out a loud dog-like howl and turned to run off into the woods. Before it could escape, my dad took a shot at it, but missed. He chased after it only a couple steps before giving up and returning to me. He told me to stay in the camper while he took care of it, whatever that meant. He also insisted that I stay behind and not follow him. He said it's best if he did this alone, and then my dad left the campsite and followed it into the woods. Obviously, I didn't like the idea of my dad hunting alone in the woods at night. I thought maybe I should go help him or something, but I still had no idea what those creatures were capable of, and I didn't want to risk both of us getting hurt or going missing. Also, I didn't want to make my dad mad by not listening to him. But this all felt so weird, so I waited a very long time, straining my ears for any sound of fighting from the woods or screaming from my dad or anything else. But there was no sound at all. Finally, I felt that too much time had passed and I was feeling like I needed to head out and check on things. I worked up the courage to leave our camper and work my way towards the spot where my dad had entered the woods. Chewy was right next to me the whole time. I don't think I could have done this without him. I didn't find anything in that spot, but then I heard something in the distance, a howling noise that seemed to echo back and forth. I couldn't tell if it was just one or multiple, but I immediately started sprinting towards the noise in case my dad was in trouble. But after a few minutes of running in this direction, I heard it again, the howling noise coming from deeper in the forest. It sounded so close now, but when I tried to tell if it was above me or around me, I couldn't tell. I kept running in the direction of the howling, but after another few minutes, it sounded like it was coming from all directions now, surrounding me. I stopped and listened, straining to hear if they were actually getting closer to me or not. And then I heard twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Something was definitely coming closer, and at this point I was sure what it was. Chewy stood right by my side as we waited for it to appear. I could see a shape moving in my direction when it finally emerged from the surrounding trees. It stood on its hind legs too, just like the previous one that night. The creature stopped walking towards us and just stood there, half in the shadows and half out with its features barely lit by moonlight. I was so close to it that I could see every detail on it. Yellow eyes, dog ears, dog teeth. The creature stared at me for a moment before slowly walking towards me. And then, when it was within 10 feet of me, like I could have jumped and touched it, it suddenly turned and disappeared off into the woods. I turned to Chewy, who was now barking in the opposite direction, and together we watched my dad slowly walk towards us with a look on his face like I've never seen before. "Did you catch it?" I asked him, concerned and relieved at the same time. My dad paused for a moment to catch his breath before responding with, "I don't know." "What do you mean?" I asked. At this point, my dad just looked confused, lost, and he shook his head before saying, "I have no idea what it was, what they are. I don't think anyone does." My dad paused again and then said, "Let's go back to the campsite. We need to tell people about this." So the three of us all headed back through the woods to the campground and told the other campers about our encounter. Everyone was obviously very concerned and said they would make sure to pack up their sites really good and be careful when they leave in the morning. And that's pretty much how it went. Everyone was freaked out, but nothing ever came back to the campground again after that night, at least not while I was there. In the morning, we told the campground manager, and he admitted that he had heard these stories before, but personally had never seen one. He did make sure to announce the encounter to everyone else staying there and promised people refunds for any days that they didn't stay for, even if they had reserved them. Most people did just that, and I could see the panic in their eyes as they piled their stuff back into their cars and left. I was too young at the time to know exactly what I should think about all of this. Honestly, part of me just thought they were really cool-looking creatures, but I think that's just the part of me that was young at the time. Now I know better, and I'm not so sure. And Chewy never seemed the same after that encounter either. He never barked at anything again after that night, which was really odd because he previously barked at everything. I guess, in the end, we were all changed by the encounter. But not in a bad way, I don't think. We're just more aware now, and definitely more cautious. It's obvious that there are things in this world that just can't be explained.